Hello, and welcome to another Time Monk Radio Network production. I'm Uranus Rising, and today is Saturday, June 30th, 2012. Today we are welcoming Roy Stemen, an English investigative journalist specializing in the paranormal. Roy describes himself as a skeptical believer, and this rational, scientific approach is very much in evidence in his latest book entitled The Big Book of Reincarnation. Roy is also the publisher of Roy Stemen's Paranormal Review, which can be found at www.paranormalreview.com, where he documents paranormal phenomena and spirituality as well as commenting on current news. His early investigations focused on the work of mediums, healers, and the spiritualist movement, while assistant editor of Psychic News, of which he is now chairman. He soon joined the Society for Psychical Research and broadened his interest to encompass parapsychology in general and reincarnation in particular. Roy edited his own magazine, Reincarnation International, later renamed Life and Soul, for 7 years, but now focuses on writing books. He is the author of several books, including One Soul, Many Lives. He was a lead investigator in an hour-long English television documentary, Back from the Dead, which explored past life memories. Roy has also contributed to many TV and radio programs and debates on past lives and afterlife communications. Using his skills as a professional journalist, Roy Stemen examines and compares the best documented case studies of reincarnation from around the world and the leading scientific theories. In his book, Roy describes the lives of those who have experienced or have been affected by reincarnation, while also investigating the leading theories posed by skeptics. We're delighted to have this opportunity to explore Roy's investigative work on reincarnation. Hello, Roy. Welcome to Time Monk Radio.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be with you.
Oh, we're delighted to have you. The Time Monk Radio administrator is Fox, and today he will be doing the recording and technical support of the show. Several members of the forum were kind enough to join us for this discussion. They include members Alan C. Moore, Disaster Cat, Green Meadow, and MWR. Again, Roy's book is entitled The Big Book of Reincarnation, and his website is www.paranormalreview.com. This interview will be available for free on YouTube, the Time Monk Radio Facebook page, and at our website, timemonkradio.com. Are you ready to begin, Roy?
I'm ready when you are. Yes.
Great. Roy, we will start off by exploring an opening background to reincarnation in your research. How has investigative journalism influenced your approach to reincarnation, and what assets and limitations do you think this provides?
Well, you've mentioned my involvement with Psychic News, and that goes back 35 to 40 years. And so my original involvement was designed to find out more about spirit communication. Now, that was very straightforward. I had a really superb sitting with the very first medium I sat with, who gave me superb evidence from a number of people, that one of whom I had no knowledge of, but was a relative of somebody I worked with. And I had to go off and check the evidence that was given. But it gave me very early on a conviction that our consciousness does survive bodily death and continues. But then, of course, that's just the first step along the way. The big question is what happens afterwards. And reincarnation, I soon discovered, was a really hot topic, and still is, within spiritualism. There are not only spiritualists who believe in reincarnation and others who are, if you'll pardon the expression, dead against it, um, but even spirit guides, supposedly evolved spiritual beings, will give very different answers to the question, is reincarnation possible? And in fact, I was in the most unique position, really, of working. I worked on Psychic News as assistant editor for 8 years, working with a man called Maurice Barbanel, who was the editor and founder of the publication, but he was also a trance medium. Now, once a week, he had a home circle in which he would go into trance, and he channeled a spiritual being that used the name Silver Birch. Apparently, this being would have been somebody quite well known historically as a spiritual teacher, I gather, but would not reveal his true identity on the basis that if he did so, people would perhaps listen to him purely because of his reputation in the past. He wanted the words that he spoke now in trance to be a measure of his spiritual understanding, I guess. So, one of the key messages that Silver Birch put across in all of his teachings was reincarnation. He argued very strongly that we all reincarnated, and we all came back many times. Now, interestingly, when Maurice Barbanel came out of trance, so he was no longer controlled by Silver Birch, he argued very strongly against reincarnation. And in the newspaper that he edited, he also often made the point of uh, attempting to discredit some of the claims for reincarnation. So it was quite an unusual situation, and it made me, it focused my mind, I guess, on the whole topic of reincarnation. And I came to the conclusion that there was no point in me listening to either the words of an evolved spiritual being who was being channeled, or the channeler, who clearly had different views, and the best way was to look at the evidence. And so that was the beginning of my pretty intensive study of all the research that's pretty well being done around the world and has taken place over the last 4 decades or more. And that soon led me to the conclusion that in some cases the evidence is extremely strong that some souls do reincarnate.
That's interesting. And so it was your journalism background that led you to take a more objective perspective on it, as well as this experience?
Very much so, yes. I mean, it was the same. I was always pretty skeptical of paranormal claims, and I still am. I tend to be open-minded about the possibility, whereas a lot of skeptics, of course, are totally closed to any possibility of a soul existing, etc. But I always say, let's see the evidence, let's analyze the evidence, and if as I was in the situation with the first medium I sat with, if the evidence is so good that you know that she could not have acquired that information that she gave me from anyone else but the person that had died and was conveying it, then you begin to get evidence. And in the cases of reincarnation, which I'll happily discuss later, I believe the same degree of evidence is available, and is convincing to anybody that is prepared to be open-minded about the subject.
Great approach. Thank you for that. And now Green Meadow has another question for you.
Hi, Roy.
Hi.
So occasionally people seem to remember detailed memories of a past life, which they should be able to trace down. But when they look for the name, a date, the house, a grave site that they remembered, they can't find any evidence for their memory. I'm curious why this occurs and where these memories come from.
That's a very important question, which I do deal with in my book in a chapter titled "Where Are Memories Stored?" Um, and actually, your question is not difficult to answer in one respect, in as far as if those past life memories cannot be corroborated because the information given is wrong, they are simply false memories. But it still raises the question, where do those memories come from? Um, I make the point very strongly in my book that we do have to treat spontaneous cases of past life memory and cases that come to the surface under hypnosis during regression sessions very, very differently. Because the spontaneous cases almost always involve children who begin talking about their past lives almost from the moment they can speak and before they've been exposed to any outside influences that could have provided the information. Whereas regression cases are invariably undertaken by adults who, by the time they have a regression, will have been exposed to magazines, books, novels, TV, documentaries, movies, a whole host of material that their subconscious will have absorbed and is quite capable of regurgitating into a concocted fictional past life, which on the face of it would appear to be totally feasible and possibly accurate. So, in fact, past life regression cases are very difficult to analyze, and they take a lot of time. But this is something obviously that reincarnation researchers are well aware of and take into consideration when they're evaluating cases. I can give an example of just how powerful the memory can be in influencing some of these cases. There was I deal in my book with a Finnish case of a 19-year-old woman in Finland who was regressed back to a past life when she said she could remember being a 13th century innkeeper's daughter and remembered the words of a song which she sang in medieval English. Now, that impressed the researchers greatly, as you can imagine. But what the researcher did at a later hypnotic session, and this is something that anybody researching reincarnation using hypnosis as a tool, what the researcher did was to put the subject under hypnosis again, but not back to the past life she remembered. She was simply put into a hypnotic state and then asked if she could go back to the time when she had read the words and music that she had recited. And she promptly gave the title of a book that she had read and completely forgotten about. It was actually a book by two uh, English writers, one of whom was the daughter of Gustav Holst. And it had been translated into the Finnish language, and she had read it, but the words and music of that particular song were in medieval English. It was quoting the original score, if you like. So, what appeared to be a very impressive proof that she had lived a life in the 13th century turned out to be no more than something that she had come across in a book and forgotten. Now, That's just to illustrate, how wary we have to be about hypnotic regression memories. But interestingly, one of a British hypnotist, Jim Alexander, I interviewed him quite a few years ago about his work, and he told me of a case that he had undertaken in which an English woman named Jill was regressed back to a life not very far before she was born. Um, and she could remember being a woman in England called Janice Kershaw, who was born in 1920 and had lived in the city of Leeds. And she gave a wealth of detail about that life, including the names of people and streets which she knew and one in which she lived. Um, and Jim Alexander went off to Leeds, dug out the archives, and found out that most of this information was absolutely accurate. Um, but strangely enough, when he checked on the address that she had given as being the address at which she lived, which was number 5 Cooper Street, he found the street and he visited it, and Cooper Street consisted of rows of terraced houses, but strangely, number 5 did not exist. There was a gap where number 5 should have been. What had happened to it, whether it had been demolished after an explosion or something, he wasn't able to find out. But he made a very interesting observation, and it sort of may partly explain the question that's been raised. This discovery led him to speculate that some force is at work which wants us to consider the meaning of life, but never actually reach a conclusion. That was his opinion. And I have noticed this in other cases where, when you think you're getting very close to getting the perfect case with dotting all the I's and crossing the T's, you suddenly find that there's a vital bit of evidence that is totally missing and cannot be placed into the jigsaw. And perhaps some of the cases you refer to where there's missing information may fall into that category if they are not false memories.
Thank you. That's really interesting.
Thank you, Green Meadow. And now Disaster Cat has a question for you, Roy.
This is Disaster Cat.
Hello there.
Hi. My first question is, some authors in the field have suggested that because time, as we know it, does not actually exist, that instead of multiple lives lived in sequence, we are somehow living all our lives at once, connected by like an oversoul, which is somehow out of time. How do you feel about this? And if you accept this theory or are familiar with it, could you please explain it further?
That's a question that often comes up because time seems to be one of the keys to unlocking the mysteries of life and the purpose of life. But I have to say that I have great difficulty in coming to terms with the concept that we might somehow all be living multiple lives simultaneously. And that some individuals can spontaneously recall, different lives that they might be leading at the same time. The reason I have problems with this time concept is because looking at spontaneous cases of mostly involving children, they invariably recall only the one life, the past life, the most immediate life that they have claimed to have lived. And those memories are very close to the surface soon after they're born, and they dominate their thoughts and their behavior in many ways. And they, to the point of them talking about their past lives, their past life families, naming the families, complaining about the life they're now leading because it isn't as nice as the one they lived before. Some of them try to run away from home and find their past life families. So those things dominate their thoughts until they're about the age of 6 or 8, and then those memories seem to dim and disappear as the excitement of this life, I guess, clouds the memory and they get on with living this life. But where we have records of more than one life being remembered by a child, they do follow linear time. They are consecutive. So there's usually a gap of, say, months or years between the last life they remembered and the life they're being born. They've been born into. So there doesn't seem to be, as far as these cases are concerned, any hint that time or distortions of time, if you like, play any role in reincarnation. The other thing that I also have a great deal of trouble getting my head around, if these other theories of multiple lives or multi-universes are to be contemplated, is that there has to be a reason for our lives, why we're here, why we're living the life we're leading now, and why it might be necessary to be reincarnated and live one or more future lives. And the suggestion seems to be that the purpose of life and reincarnation is to give us many opportunities to experience a whole host of different scenarios in physical in a physical domain, and to learn from those experiences. And if time isn't linear in that experience for the soul, then I can't see how living a life, having bad experiences, etc., and then learning from them, could then be played out in the next life, if that makes sense. It seems to me that it's a chicken and egg situation, really. That one needs to follow the other. That's not to say that I'm not open to the possibility of multi-universes, etc., but I just don't see any evidence for that in the case studies that I've looked at. On the other hand, if we look at regression cases, then there's a different story that comes out of that, and particularly regression cases where an individual not only is regressed back to one or more past lives, but is regressed to the point between death in one life and birth in the next life, and what is called an interlife stage, if you like, during which it is aimed that they not only have the opportunity to review their past life and see what went right and went wrong, but also to discuss that life with evolved spiritual beings or spirit guides or whatever, angels or whatever we want to call them. And between them, they reach a decision that it's right that they should come back and live another life. So that tells us a little bit about that inter-life stage in the process. But I also cover in the book one or two rather bizarre, I have to say they're rather bizarre, cases that came to my attention that really were most unusual. One of them involved a past life regressionist called Dolores Cannon, who managed to communicate with the spirit of Nostradamus through one of her subjects. And she claimed that he was able to explain in more detail about some of the quatrains that predicted the future. But then her subject suddenly had to leave and go and live somewhere else. But she managed to find others who, at the same time, were able to communicate with Nostradamus. And the claim she has made in a series of 5 books about Nostradamus was that he was not only communicating but through these people from the spirit dimension in which he was now to be found, but that he also was able to change the future um, in various ways. Now that's very difficult for me to comprehend, I have to say, but it's a possibility that maybe time is more fluid than the spontaneous cases suggest, and I have to be open to any possibility. I'm not closing the door on it. I try not to be dogmatic on any aspect of uh, the reincarnation process or the philosophical implications of reincarnation. I think it's still very early days, and we still have an awful lot to learn.
Well, kind of as a follow-up to all this wonderful information you've given us, I did kind of wonder that if we don't seem somehow to be living all at once, in some way we can't really comprehend, is it still the case that we tend to incarnate upon the obvious earthly timeline? And I think you were alluding to some of that in your answer before, but just kind of to spell out, is like the next lifetime likely to be in our future, or do we sort of dip in and out of time? For example, could my next life be in the Roman Empire, depending on the lessons that we need to learn? And I really thank you for your answers.
Well, I've seen no evidence to suggest that a soul goes backwards and forwards in time willy-nilly. As I say, I've hinted that it seems to follow linear time, um, and many of the cases that have been carefully researched with children feature fears and phobias or behavioral traits which appear to have their origins in a past life that is remembered and can be verified, um, and was clearly a previous life. However, there's a regressionist called Goldberg who claims that we can travel forward in time. I should say, first of all, that my book covers a whole series of experiments that were done which tried to take people forward in time to predict their own lives, future lives in this life, and then what future lives they may lead after death in this life. Now, the evidence so far isn't very convincing, I have to say, that most of the predictions that I've seen recorded in those experiments have not come about, at least not within the time frame that was suggested. And one explanation for that has been that we each as individuals have free will, and maybe their free will has changed the future that they were foreseeing during hypnosis. Um, but if that's the case, then I don't see any point in doing hypnotic progression, as it's called, into a future life if it's not going to actually tell you uh, what is going to happen. Now, the the person that has probably written the most about this, as I say, is a regressionist called Goldberg, who happened to be I'm trying to remember the name of the singer. Her name was Laird, but I can't remember her forename. But he hypnotized and regressed this quite well-known singer. She had a hit record around the world, a disco number. But under hypnosis, she claimed to recall being Marilyn Monroe, and he published a book about this. So that was a very straightforward reincarnation case. However, he has since gone on record as talking about other subjects that he's dealt with, where the individuals go forward in time, or that their problems that they've come to consult him about prove not to be in their past life, but in their future life. So this is very much. This sounds very much like the dipping in and out of time that you're suggesting. in one particular case, a man came to him because he had a compulsive behavioral problem, which took him, he was washing his hands almost daily. And under hypnosis, he went forward in time, apparently, to a life in which he was involved working at a nuclear power station. And because of his a lack of attention or something of that nature, he caused some sort of meltdown, and people died, and the whole area became contaminated. Now, this goes forward many, many centuries, but he believed that the washing of his hands in this life was a way of expunging the guilt, if you like, of the nuclear fallout that was caused by him in the previous life. And what Goldberg says is that not only was he able to cure the man's compulsive behavior, but he was able to reprogram him somehow so that in that future life, when he eventually gets around to leading it, he won't cause the nuclear meltdown that apparently he would have done without this reprogramming. I will reserve reserve my judgment on that. It sounds more like science fiction than fact, but the full story is in my book, and it's in books written by Goldberg. But it's a further indication of just how way out some of the thoughts on time and the implications they have on reincarnation studies. And at the end of the day, my approach, as I say, is I'll listen to them, I'll try to understand them, but at the end of the day, I have to go back to what is provable, and that's really taking us back to cases where children in particular are able to provide information about a past life that is proved. Future lives, unfortunately, we can't really prove anyway, because they're so far in the future. We will not be, any of us will be around to determine whether they were right or wrong, unless of course we reincarnate, and then we will be around, but we'll be in other bodies, and maybe we won't remember we even knew about this from this life. So it gets more and more complex as you go deeper into it.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Disaster Cat. I have a question for you. Roy, you've been speaking about regression, and I wondered what your thoughts on regression and past life hypnosis therapy is. And the specific question I have, does expectation by the therapist on the client have any influence on it?
I think the answer has to be that it does have quite an influence on it, although therapists are often totally surprised by the outcome of a regression session. That is, what the patient tells them. Interestingly, quite a number of established therapists began not by looking for past life evidence or offering past life therapy. They were very straightforward therapists who were looking for causes of problems in their patients' present lives. In fact, some of them probably didn't have any belief in reincarnation or interest in reincarnation. But invariably, at some point, whilst regressing a patient to the cause of a problem that they have come to the therapist in the hope of ridding themselves of, a past life suddenly slips out. There was one case, I think it was Brian Weiss, who said that he'd forgotten or didn't realize the necessity to say to his patient under hypnosis to go back to the point in this life where this problem began, or whatever the question was. And because he didn't use the term in this life, he suddenly found his patient was talking about a past life. It was a revelation to him, that the patient could even go back beyond birth in this life, but he had to listen to it and take it on board. Now, that's a similar experience has happened to a number of hypnotists, and they found not only that this was that the past life therapy was worth exploring, particularly if they couldn't find the cause of the problem in this life, um, but also that past life therapy appears to be a very, very effective tool in overcoming the problems of many of the patients that consult them. Now, having said that, there are also quite a few therapists that I've interviewed who do not necessarily believe that what their patients are recounting during a regression session is evidence of reincarnation at all. They believe that the person is simply um, coming up with a fictional account of life that will enable them to come to terms with the problem, if you like, and that having done that, they they're they're personally satisfied that they've found the cause and they overcome it. So um, the simple answer is I'm very, very cautious about any past lives that are recorded under hypnosis, um, partly because, as I've said before, that we are all exposed to so much material data that we can absorb and regurgitate, that trying to sift that from anything that might be a past life memory is very difficult. Um, but I'm also totally satisfied that past life therapy can be a very, very useful therapeutic tool. So I'm not against it at all. I think it can be valuable. The distinction I must make, of course, with hypnotic regression and therapy is that there are some hypnotists who are only interested in trying to prove reincarnation with hypnotic regression, and they ask very specific questions, such as where are you living in that past life? What do you see? What are the names of your wife or your husband, your children? What's the name of the road you live in? All the sort of evidence that you might ask a witness in a crime, maybe, or something.
In a trial, yes.
Yeah. Whereas a therapist is not going to ask any of those questions because they do not achieve anything in terms of the well-being of the patient. Will ask instead questions that relate to the problem that they have, and will be asking, why do you feel the way you do? What caused that? And and really explore a whole different area of the psyche in a way that works. So. I hope that's answered the question. It's a complicated one, but one that we do need to explore.
Absolutely, that's exactly what I was thinking, and it is a fascinating area, and I thank you for that. Now we're going to go deeper into the topic, and we'd like to delve into the purpose, reason, and evidence of reincarnation. And I've got a question for you. What have you found in your research about the soul that reincarnates? And what is its purpose in reincarnating?
Well, the thing about finding out about the soul is that we have to turn to a lot of different sources for a real understanding of the soul. I think the problem
Mm,
with the cases of spontaneous reincarnation is that we're dealing with children who can just remember the highlights, if you like, of a past life, in which they will talk about their emotions and things that happened in their lives. And it could be, it's just like reading probably a very simple child's report at school about a day in their life, if you like. It doesn't tell us very much about the soul at all. The important thing, I think, though, from reincarnation study is that even if just one of these cases is so powerful, so strong, that it cannot be explained away in any other way, then I think that it gives us evidence, if not proof, that we are more than flesh and blood, that we have a soul, that we have a spiritual dimension, and that it does continue after our death in another life. I mean, similar evidence can be found in the writings about mediumship and spiritualism, and also from near-death experiences. And I think when you begin to put all those different strands of evidence together, they give a very real evidence that we are much more than just flesh and bones. But what does it teach us about the soul? The only answer I can give to that is that if you look at some of those interlife communications that I mentioned earlier, where people appear to be reviewing their life and making decisions, then I think you begin to see a bit more about maybe the mechanics of reincarnation and how the soul behaves in those circumstances. And I mentioned earlier Brian Weiss and his book, Many Lives, Many Masters, gave a fascinating case about a patient of his called Catherine, who was able to recall several past lives that not only shed light on her fears and phobias in her present life, but also cured them. But what made her sessions with Brian Weiss so remarkable were her her ability to go in between those lives that she recalled, and she talked about talking with the masters who who she met in that interlife state, and they were able to speak directly through her, so she was like channeling them to speak to Brian Weiss, the hypnotist. So here was he trying to help his subject by regressing her to past lives, and suddenly he found that he was speaking apparently to evolved spiritual beings who were using his patient as a medium, if you like, or a channel for their communications. Now, he was very, I think, reticent and skeptical about this when it first happened. But what changed his mind was when they conveyed to him personal information about his father and his baby son, both
Oh
of
my
whom,
goodness.
and Catherine, his subject, could not have known any of that information. Um, she described, or they, the masters, described to him exactly the cause of his son's death, which was a very complicated medical condition. Um, so he was very um, impressed, and I think he explored this with other patients later. Um, to have discovered that apparently we all have masters or guides that are with us and help us, and the interlife state is where we learn more about what our life was meant to have achieved in its last incarnation and what it will be doing in the next. These master spirits, incidentally, told Catherine that she had lived 86 times in the physical state so far. They didn't say how many lives she had to live before she got things right. Um, so so those sort of reports are uh, quite a useful insight into the ways in which the soul might work. Now, from a skeptical point of view, the problem we have with these cases is that Brian Weiss and most of the other psychotherapists do not name their patients, and this is understandable. Their patients consult them confidentially. They don't expect their personal details to be provided to the public in books and other things. So they're usually given a pseudonym. And if I were to be totally skeptical, I could argue that all of these reports are no more than inspired fiction that are made up to look like they are the reports of people undergoing hypnosis. I don't believe that, but I mean, it's you have to be you have to approach some of these claims with caution. But overall, I think the indication is that the soul is probably around for a long time. That we often get very disheartened with life and not achieving what we wanted to, or not being as good as we thought we should be. But it is just like one single pearl each life on a very long necklace of pearls, and we've got many other opportunities to do better, and we're not doing it alone. We do have others in a spiritual realm that are there to help us.
Well, thank you for that, Roy. That's a wonderful explanation. Much appreciated. Disaster Cat, you have the next question for Roy?
Yes, this is Disaster Cat again. I've run into quite a number of people who remember past lives as the same historical individual. In your view, how is this best explained? Multiple universe theory? People who were close to a historical individual in a past life becoming a bit confused and identifying with the historical personage in trance or dreams to the point where they believe they were this individual? Soul splitting into more than one person? Actual false memory syndrome? Something else altogether?
Well, I think people claiming to have been a famous person in a past life attract a lot of attention from the media, but they are in the minority, I have to say. And some, of course, could be genuine memories of a previous existence when they were that person. After all, if reincarnation is a fact, even famous people have to be reborn, and they probably are not so famous in the life that they next lead. In my book, I deal with 3 cases which are not as evidential as the spontaneous cases in most respects. One is a Chicago man who claims to recall the life of Tsar Nicholas II. There's also Marilyn Monroe that I mentioned earlier. And there's also an English woman called, trying to remember her name, A.J. Stewart, who remembers being King James IV of Scotland. And that was a spontaneous memory when she was quite young. She actually became a playwright in England, but decided after remembering to be the Scottish king, she moved up to Scotland to live, which is probably a good sign of her loyalty to the country, I guess. I mention those cases, though I don't attempt to analyze them or say how accurate they might be, partly because the problem we have with all such claims is that famous people are so well chronicled that it's almost impossible for someone making such a claim to provide any shred of new evidence that isn't already in the public domain. So you know, they're interesting to read about, but I don't think they add an awful lot to the evidence for reincarnation. As far as two people claiming to be in the same person, particularly a historical person in a past life, I think, and this is the skeptic in me answering you, I think it's far more logical to assume that at least one of them is making a false claim, perhaps unwittingly, but has a false memory. And that might be because they, in a past life, were, as you suggest, associated in some way with that historical person, and now those memories are still there, but they are misidentifying them, if you like, and identifying far more with the person that they were associated with than with their actual own existence in that past life. Maybe they had a fixation about that person, but I think a lot of these things we have to be so cautious about because, you know, we know that people do have very different attitudes to celebrity status, if you like, and some often feel that by association with claiming to be a famous past life individual that they will be looked on more favorably perhaps in this life. I used to do quite a few TV studio debates here in the UK, and one of the people that was often invited to come along was a lady who claimed to be able to remember her previous life as Queen Elizabeth I, and she always came dressed in flowing gowns and a tiara. Nobody accepted her as being who she claimed to be, but she, for a television program, it always made it a fun thing to watch. Although I must say, it also cast the whole subject of reincarnation in a probably a rather absurd light in a way. But probably the simplest thing to say is that false memory is usually involved in cases where there is any conflict. And as I say, our minds anyway can come up with so much material that we've been exposed to in our lives that you know, we don't even remember where it came from ourselves. I can illustrate that, incidentally, with a case from a Welsh hypnotherapist called Arnold Bloxham, who conducted a very impressive series of regression sessions here in the UK in the 1950s, and a fascinating book and a TV documentary called More Lives Than One was produced, and they were based on the tape recordings he made of several subjects. But the star subject was an office worker called Jane Evans, who he regressed to 6 former lives, one of which was in the 3rd century as a tutor's wife in the Roman British city that became York. She also remembered being a 12th century Jewess, also in York. She remembered being a servant to the French merchant prince Jacques Coeur in the 15th century. She was a Spanish handmaiden to Catherine of Aragon in the 16th century, and she was also a poor sewing girl in the reign of Queen Anne in the early 17th century. And finally, she was an American nun at the turn of the 20th century. Now, I would say that all these memories were recounted under hypnosis with an incredibly convincing difference in the personality of the people that she was apparently remembering being. She was reenacting episodes, if you like, from their lives. She may well have lived other lives, but after recalling 6 of them, she became slightly fed up with the whole process and also quite frightened by it and refused to do any more regression. Now, Her experiences have often been quoted as some of the best evidence for reincarnation, but unfortunately, one of the investigators, a good friend of mine, Melvin Harris, who was very skeptical of reincarnation, he and others pointed out that her memories of the French merchant Jacques Coeur's life were not complete. They were not inaccurate. What she remembered was proved to be right. However, she didn't talk about certain aspects of his life, including his family, and he had about at least 4 children, I think, and she made no mention of those at all, which was really strange, since she would have been very familiar with the children since she worked in the house. And eventually, Melvin came across a 1948 novel which was based on Coeur's life. It was called The Money Man, by a writer called T.B. Costain. And he wrote a fictional account of Coeur's life, but it was based very much on the historical evidence of Coeur's life. But interestingly, he, in that novel, left out all mention of Coeur's children. And when he was asked about that later, he said it was because I think they interfered with the narrative of his novel. So it was easier just to deal with the bits, include the bits that made it into a good novel. The conclusion we have to come to there is that Jane Evans, although she was totally convincing in her regression life as a servant to Coeur's family, had clearly based those memories entirely on the reading of the novel by T.B. Costain. And that was not a novel that she has any conscious memory of ever reading. So, we have to be, this is why we do need to be cautious of accepting hypnotic regression cases, and why this may well explain also why some of the accounts we hear about and read are quite confusing and conflicting as well. So when in doubt, I always refer to the spontaneous cases with children where none of these influences can be used as evidence against reincarnation, if you like.
Well, thank you. I now have a follow-up question from Green Meadow. Could people pick up any past lives or lives via the Akashic records? Dolores Cannon and several people picking up Nostradamus, for example.
Yes, I think that is certainly possible. And of course, there are other paranormal abilities, for example, remote viewing, where individuals apparently can send, or not send maybe, but to reach out to different parts of the universe. There was the famous case with Ingo Swann, where he was able to predict the rings around a planet that had not yet been detected until a spacecraft got there, and also to go backwards in time, or to follow and read the mind of somebody that's sent out to a location. So I think we have to be open to the possibility that some of the cases of reincarnation may be some sort of paranormal ability to acquire information from the Akashic records. But the difficulty I have with accepting that as an explanation that would apply to all cases is that if for example, I always return, as you gather, to the spontaneous cases of children. If they have an ability to tune into the Akashic records and pick up the information that they're talking about, why is it they can only pick up that that information about one life, the life of the person they say they were in a previous life. And also, if when they are taken to the village that they claim to have lived in, how are they able to recognize members of the family and give their names, for example? And there are cases in my book where this happens. I find that the Akashic Records theory is something that one has to take on board along with a whole range of other alternative explanations, and they need to be set against reincarnation. But in these spontaneous cases, I still find that the theory of reincarnation is the one that fits the evidence better than any other alternative.
Thank you.
That's fascinating, Roy. Now we've got a question from MWR.
Good evening, Roy. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us.
My pleasure.
Thermodynamics basically states that all order goes to disorder. You have speculated about group spirits kind of reincarnating in many souls. That's sort of a conundrum in itself there. But it's been speculated this is a learning time, when souls either come back to learn life lessons better and move on to a different lesson, or move on to a different life, move to a different higher entity, whatever. Wouldn't it stand to reason that the balance of the souls coming back would have a more malevolent, darker passions, and might just account for there seeming to be more evil manifesting now, or that we seem more exposed to more negative as these souls don't learn and pass on and start to tip the balance in terms of numbers?
I actually don't subscribe to the view that there is more evil manifesting now. I think we don't have to go back too far in history to find such horrors as the Spanish Inquisition and, of course, the Holocaust to know that evil has been around for centuries. If it seems worse now, it may be because there are more people on the planet now. And I'm always cautious about the conclusion anyway that we all reincarnate. Highlighted as being very strong evidence suggests that those individuals have reincarnated, but that may not be the norm. Maybe only a minority of people are required to reincarnate, while the rest of us move on into other dimensions to continue our spiritual evolution. There's also a question about where all the new souls come from for our planet's rapidly increasing population. So perhaps the race, by breeding so rapidly, is opening the door to less evolved spirits to incarnate on Earth. And your guess is as good as mine, I guess, as to where they might be coming from. I often wonder if there's like a soul factory somewhere in the universe that says, Earth's in need of another billion people. Let's churn out some more souls and get them over there as fast as we can. Or perhaps there are group souls which, when the population increases, need to fragment and incarnate into more bodies in order to animate a growing population. I mean, this is all speculation. I don't particularly accept any of these hypotheses because I feel there are some areas about which we just can't provide answers or even begin to understand. So the study of reincarnation, all I can say positively is that it raises as many questions as it does answers. And your questions are one of those questions, I'm afraid, for which I don't think we have an answer yet.
Well, and that's fair enough. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Good.
Thank you, MWR. And now Green Meadow has a couple questions for you, Roy. Green Meadow?
This question is from Rusky. If we have lived before, how is it most of us cannot remember our former lives?
That's a point that I often make to other people, because clearly not remembering past lives is the norm. And it does suggest that maybe we are not meant to remember past lives at a conscious level anyway, though hypnotic regression does suggest that we may all remember them at a deep subconscious level. What is interesting to me is that those individuals in spontaneous cases that remember past lives are always, not always, but half the time at least, are recalling violent deaths. This has become clear from an analysis of the work of Professor Ian Stevenson, who was a professor at the University of Virginia and was also the world's foremost expert on reincarnation, having spent 5 decades or more investigating well over 2,000 cases around the world. His statistics show that overall, violent deaths were a feature of half of his cases, or 51% to be precise, and they varied from a low rate of 29% among the Haida people of northwestern North America to an astonishing 3/4 of cases, 74%, in Turkey. And it raises the question, why is this? And one possibility has to be that the violent death created such trauma for the individual that he or she continues to recall that event for the first few years of their new life on Earth. Another interpretation, however, could be that because their previous life was brought to a violent and premature end, they were required to be reborn in order to live a full life in the physical world. But for most of us who perhaps passed away peacefully in our beds in a previous existence, there is no memory of that former life because it is in the past, and our purpose in being reborn is to focus on our present life and not to be encumbered by memories of what we did in all our previous lives.
Makes sense.
Hmm.
So here's another question. So what's the use of knowing of our past lives?
Well, for most of us, I don't believe there is any use in knowing about a past life at a conscious level, which is probably why we don't remember them. And even those children that do remember them forget them quite quickly. But the indications are that at a much deeper level, and we're talking about something like the oversoul, you and I know all about our previous lives and what the purpose of this life is. And we as individuals can intuitively tune into that so that we stay on the straight and narrow path in making our spiritual journey through this life and enabling us to emerge from it at death, spiritually enhanced in some way. Now that's the theory, if you like. I have to say that looking at the cases of spontaneous reincarnation recall, there doesn't seem to be a lot of rhyme or reason in many of the lives that children remember. Sometimes in this life they are living a completely different lifestyle to before. Maybe they were rich in a past life and now they're poor, or maybe it's vice versa. But the suggestion is that no two lives are the same, and there are lessons to be learned from every life. But my own attitude, and this is why I personally have never had a past life regression, is that I'm enjoying this life, and I'm hopefully remembering deep down why I'm here and what I'm supposed to be doing, and I just jolly well get on and do it. And what I did in my past life is gone, and what I might be doing in a future life is yet to come. So let's focus on today and make the most of it.
Yeah, that does make sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Green Meadow. We now have a question from Alan Moore. Is there any evidence of people having indications of lives they may live in the future?
Well, there have been experiments conducted that I've just referred to earlier about people being progressed to future lives. There is a woman in England, a British woman, Jenny Cookel, who in fact was featured as in one of the best cases from Britain of reincarnation. She remembered being an Irish woman in the past, her past life. The story's in my book. I won't go into detail now, but basically, she was born with a knowledge that she had left something undone in her past life. She'd died in childbirth, and she knew that her family of 8 children would have been cast to the winds. Really, they would have been farmed out to different families who would have adopted them. And she felt it was her purpose in this life to bring them back together again. And she did precisely that. She was able to find the family. Some of them were living within a few streets of each other, but they had no idea they were related to each other because they were so young when they were given to other families to look after. So she reunited them, wrote a book about it, and a TV documentary was made about it as well, which is fascinating. The reason I mention that is because she has gone on to write another book in which she talks about a future life that she believes she has seen, and in which she will be living a life in Nepal. And in that life, she says the population of the earth has decreased quite dramatically. Again, as I mentioned before, the problem with future lives is that it all sounds very interesting, but it's something that you and I are not going to be able to confirm unless we live such a long time that we're still around when those lives start coming to fruition.
Well, thank you for that. It's quite interesting. We are speaking with Roy Stemen, author of The Big Book of Reincarnation. You can also find out more about his work at Roy's website, which is www.paranormalreview.com. Now we're going to move on to our last topic, which we would like to explore as those of social aspects and the impact of beliefs in religions. Roy, how do you see cultural or religious traditions influencing and having a bias for or against reincarnation?
They have quite a big impact, in fact. I'm going to start with spontaneous cases. What we find with the children who remember past lives, if they are able to recollect the interlife state between death in the past life and birth into their current life, they often describe a scene in that interlife state where they see either Buddha or Jesus or some other spiritual being that is totally in accord with their religious traditions or their family's religious traditions. Cultural and religious traditions have always had an impact, I think, on the way people take a look at reincarnation or explain the processes involved. But the interesting thing is that it might also have an impact on the processes themselves. I went to the Lebanon on 2 visits to make a TV documentary about the Druze communities. The Druze are a sect which has its origin in Islam, but unlike Islam, it believes totally in reincarnation, and they also, for some reason, the Druze people have almost in every family somebody that recalls a past life quite clearly. Now, the view of reincarnation amongst the Druze is that you do not miss a breath when you die, that your last breath in one life is followed by your first breath in your new life. So in other words, if you get shot or knocked down or whatever, or die in your bed at 6 p.m. on one evening, at 1 second past 6 p.m., you are being born somewhere else within a Druze family, because they believe that the souls of Druze only reincarnate amongst the Druze community. It's an interesting theory. It doesn't accept that there's an interlife state at all. And there are cases where the evidence seems to suggest that some individuals do in fact reincarnate almost instantaneously. But I must also say that some of the cases I investigated, and those are in Lebanon, in Syria, and Israel, do show what I would say is quite a normal pattern of months or even years between the death in one life and birth in the next. I was able to talk to the Druze spiritual leader about the Druze belief. They were always regarded as a very secretive people, but they are much more open these days. And he confirmed that was their belief, that you are reborn instantaneously on death. And I pointed out to him some of the cases that I was familiar with where there was this longer gap between death and rebirth. And his explanation for that was simply that those souls would have been reborn during that period, but their life was so short that they no longer have a memory of that life between the one they can recall and the life they're leading now. He may be right, but I have to say also that looking at the figures for the mortality rate amongst the Druze and also the birth rate, there didn't seem to be any parallels that would suggest that their belief in instantaneous birth and death was correct. Another interesting case outside the Druze community about the impact of belief or other impact came to light when I went to visit Dr. Satwan Pasricha, who's a well-known reincarnation researcher in India. She is a child psychologist who works at the Department of Clinical Psychology at the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences in Bangalore, which is in southern India, which is where I met her. And she's investigated numerous cases in India, but she has to travel to the north of India to find them. And she, in fact, wrote a paper for the Journal of Scientific Exploration in 2001, drawing attention to this fact. And what she said was that that while cases from South India show features similar to those of North Indian cases, which is, I have to say, is not surprising since reincarnation is pretty well accepted throughout India, both by Hindus and Buddhists. she says the belief in reincarnation is held as strongly in South India as it is in North India, yet there is a marked disparity in terms of the ease with which cases can be found in the North compared to the South. Cases in the South may be underreported, she suggested, but there is some indication that they may actually be less frequent. And her paper draws attention to this anomaly. So she didn't come up with any explanation as to why, but she just knows that even in a country where reincarnation is accepted, there geographically there are much more cases reported in the north than in the south. So we don't always understand why it is that happens, and why in Lebanon, Syria, and Israel, the Druze have a very high incidence of past life recall, whereas in America and in Europe, the cases of reincarnation, reported cases that is, are very few and far between.
That's really fascinating, because I had only heard of the Buddhist tradition, which is 40 days between lives. And so this gives a much broader, fuller perspective. I thank you for that. The next question is from Disaster Cat.
Hi.
Roy, hi. How do you feel about the concept of the karma of nations, or the idea that large groups of people, larger than families, may have a mass experience, good or bad, that will tend to cause them to come back together in additional life returns to rework those issues and or experience the consequences of those past life actions?
I have to say that I tend to steer very clear of karma or discussing karma, even though I accept that it probably exists, because it's impossible for us to interpret its workings. And those who attempt to do so usually find themselves in deep water. But I will risk getting into deep water in answering your question. We had here in the UK the English soccer coach a few years ago by name of Glenn Hoddle, who was a very famous footballer, lost his job as the English coach after commenting on the fact that disabled people, in his view, were suffering their problems because of the law of cause and effect of karma, because of something they did in their past lives. And the danger with coming to that sort of conclusion, of course, is that maybe people that have some disability or suffer some illness in this life, that has happened out of choice, that they've chosen to be able to experience those problems in order to overcome them as part of their learning experience. So I don't think any of us can make a judgment as to how karma operates in individual cases, and I'm afraid the same is true of national karma. But if karma works, then I'm sure there must be national karma as well as individual karma, simply because countries do work together cohesively with certain aims and intentions, and I see no reason why that wouldn't be the case. Interestingly, where reincarnation seems to occur in families or groups, so we get a group karma as well, if you like, and it appears from some of the cases to introduce new dynamics into family relationships. In some of the best cases on record, for example, an individual can recall being a former family member. Professor Ian Stevenson, I mentioned earlier, did a lot of work with indigenous people in North America, and he cites the case of a man called Jimmy Svensson from southeastern Alaska, who told his parents that when he was just 2 years old that he had been his mother's brother, John Sisko, who died in suspicious circumstances in his previous life. And another individual from the same area, a man called Victor Vincent, was certain his deceased sister, Gertrude, had been reborn as her own granddaughter, also named Gertrude, which means that the mother of the younger Gertrude had given birth to her own mother. So it gets complicated and complex, but maybe that's how we work out our relationships. That children then become parents of the people who were their parents in a past life. Interestingly, Joan Rivers was hypnotized by Brian Weiss on a TV program, and she recalled a life in England in 1835 where she was a gentrified woman and the mother of 3 children. And suddenly, during that regression, she said she recognized her 3-year-old daughter in that life as being her mother in this one. So maybe we should all look upon our relatives in a different light and treat them better, maybe. I don't know. But it suggests we think that there's a tendency, I think, for all of us to think in terms of just I will reincarnate. Who will I be in my next life? Who was I in my past life? But it may be that we are not as individual as we think we are, and that we are, in fact, part of a group soul of people either living in one family or even people living in one neighborhood. There was research done by a therapist called Marge Ryder, who had a patient. She was near Lake Elsinore in California, and she regressed a patient to a past life, and he could recall being in a small town of Virginia, Millborough. In time, she had 35 people from the Lake Elsinore area who came to her for hypnotic regression, and they all, during those sessions, talked about a previous life when they had lived in this little town called Millborough. She wrote a book called Return to Millborough, quoting the evidence that came up. And other work done by another regressionist, Barbara Lane, who was fascinated by people who spend their weekends. We're talking about American. She was an American researcher. Spend their weekends reenacting the Civil War, wearing heavy uniforms and eating stale hardtack and reenacting battles from 130 years ago or more. And she was fascinated by the possibility that their enthusiasm for reenacting that period in time was because they somehow had hidden, buried memories of that period. And she found 12 reenactors who were willing to, one of them was a woman, who were willing to be regressed, and they all recalled a Civil War existence. So those sessions, by the way, were conducted in 1993 and 94 as part of Barbara Lane's dissertation for a PhD in metaphysical sciences from Westbrook University in New Mexico. And she subsequently expanded that into a popular book called Echoes from the Battlefield. So I think, we should perhaps all stop thinking too much in individual terms about reincarnation and realize that perhaps we are part of a much bigger group. And maybe, as an English writer called Arthur Gurdam suggested, we are, in fact, all part of one huge human group. He wrote a book called We Are One Another, so that deep down we are all somehow interrelated at a spiritual level.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Disaster Cat. And now we have some questions from Alan C. Moore.
Yes, hello there, Roy.
Hi.
Earlier in one of your answers, you talked about an in-between state between two lifetimes in which a person might be working with a spirit guide. And in the Buddhist tradition, they refer to that period as the bardo. And I'm wondering if you are aware of any other spiritual traditions that also talk about that period, that in-between period.
Alan, Hinduism, of course, does talk about that interlife state, and Buddhism came after Hinduism and was very influenced by it. So that's not a surprise.
Right.
However, the early Buddhists didn't all embrace the bardo state. There were different schools of thought, and it's really the Tibetan Buddhism that particularly adheres to that belief. My own view is that those religious beliefs are based, in part anyway, on cases of past life recall that must have occurred all those centuries ago, and gave rise to the teachings of the Buddha and others. There are other religions which teach reincarnation, on the other hand, like the Druze that I've already mentioned,
Right.
that don't require belief in any interlife state. They just, as I said, believe it's an instantaneous process. As far as I'm concerned, the interlife state does make sense. Just the logistics of getting people to be born at the same moment as people die is difficult to comprehend. And it also implies, if we accept the Druze argument that there is no interlife state and it is all an instantaneous process, it implies that our lives do not have the free will that we believe they have, and that our deaths are predetermined as much as our births into a new life. I would like to think that there is rhyme and reason in what happens, and that the interlife state is a period during which we have a time to rest, to consider, and to make choices about our next life. But that's just a personal view, which is not really based on anything more than trying to read between the lines of some of the case studies that I've looked at. But as far as I know, the Bardo state is just Buddhism and Hinduism. I'm not really aware of any other religions that believe it. I should add, by the way, that recent polls in both Britain and the United States do indicate that Christians, by and large, have a much greater belief in reincarnation than we would expect them to from their own religious beliefs. I think the figure I saw quoted was that 22% of Christians in the United States either believe in reincarnation or are open to the possibility, even though Christianity doesn't teach it. So, I think we have to be just a little bit wary about claiming too much of what people believe and what religions teach, because I think people are now beginning to think much more for themselves, and they might still adhere to a particular religious belief, but they will also add on their own beliefs that I assume are based on things they've read or experienced themselves. And that's a good thing. I think the more open we are about the possibilities of life and death, the more we'll learn.
Well, I certainly agree with that. And I also agree with what you said about the period between births where we actually could have the opportunity to learn and grow spiritually. My next question is also somewhat related to that, and that is, have you found in your research any evidence of certain religions actually removing the notion of reincarnation from their scriptures?
Well, the one that is often quoted is, of course, again in Christianity, and the decision that by Oregon, that the belief in not in rebirth, but in a previous existence was deemed to be anathema, and it was ruled out, and that generally is regarded as being the reason why there is no indication of reincarnation in the Christian teachings. By previous existence, what I guess he was arguing was that when a soul is created specifically for one life on Earth, I don't think the anathema covered future lives, but future life would be in heaven anyway, I assume. So so that's certainly a case where religious teaching was changed. I mentioned this 22% of Christians being open to religion, to reincarnation. I happen to know in the UK two quite prominent clergymen who actually taught reincarnation as being a fact. One of them was the man who started the Samaritans charity, which I believe you have in the States, but it's a large charity here that helps people who have suicidal tendencies. And he was a priest based in London, Reverend Chad Vara by name, and he not only believed reincarnation to be a fact, but also could recall some of his previous lives. Another English clergyman was a Methodist who also wrote a couple of papers about reincarnation and became totally convinced that reincarnation happened. So we see that even though there's no evidence for it or no teachings in the Bible or elsewhere, it doesn't stop even eminent Christians from adopting it as part of their belief, and they don't find that it conflicts against the Christian teachings. And I think that's becoming more widespread as we progress.
Thank you so much. Those are wonderful answers.
Good.
Thank you, Alan. And now we have some questions from Green Meadow.
Hello. I have a question from Bluebell. She's asking, given the wide variety of life forms on Earth and potentially elsewhere, why do other life memories tend to focus on human existences or experiences?
I find people are fascinated by the possibility that they might either have been an animal in a past life or come back or will come back as an animal. I was asked the other day in an interview whether someone might come back as a butterfly. I don't know why they chose a butterfly, but there you go. I can't see any evidence having achieved the state of being a human being that one would go back to being an animal. I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but I would think that our spiritual evolution will continue in animal form or some other form that is more evolved. As for whether there's any evidence of people having had other existences as an animal, that would be almost impossible to prove. I mean, if someone said they were a dog in a past life, we wouldn't be able to take them back to that past life and interview them, because we'd only get a bark or two, and that would be about the sum total of the communication. So, but having said all that, I think there could be a case argued that that animals evolve over time to the point where they can become human, and that's all part of some evolutionary chain as life expands and evolves on a planet. Um, but I'm finding it's difficult enough to convince people, even from very good case studies, that humans can reincarnate as humans. So I'm steering clear of any other possibilities for the time being, particularly as it would be hard to prove that.
Have you ever heard of anything? You know, it's a big galaxy out there of other life forms, not even from Earth, or?
No, not as such. There are, of course, some channelers who talk about other life forms being able to take form as human beings, and we've got to be open to that. I mean, I totally agree. We're a very small planet in a very large universe, and I would hope that we're not the only one that has life on it, because if so, I sometimes feel we're not making a very good job of it. And so I would have thought that, just as you know, we're learning to travel in space, and in centuries to come, we will probably populate other planets, if not in this solar system, maybe elsewhere. But I think at a spiritual level, that is a possibility that could well be open to us already. I mentioned earlier about where do all the new souls come from, and maybe some souls do come from other planets, from other different life forms, but they take on a human existence for at least one life on this planet. So it's a possibility. It's very easy to get carried away with hypotheses and conjecture, and I always try to come back and be as grounded as I can, just in the cases that we really know we can talk about with confidence.
Yeah, and you do a very good job at finding real pieces that fit to some of the story. My next question is from Rusky. Do we meet family and friends again? And is there a purpose to that? And is it terrible we don't recognize people?
I think I've touched on the group soul idea and the possibility of families reincarnating in different relationships. So I think it's quite likely. There is this fear that one fear, I think, amongst spiritualists, and I'm very involved and have been with spiritualism in the UK. Many spiritualists don't believe in reincarnation, because I think that's partly out of a fear that their hope that when they get to the next world, they'll be met by all their loved ones and be reunited. The fear that when they get there, there'll be no loved ones waiting for them, because they will all be reincarnated. And I can understand that fear. But of course, in a way, that's a very Christian outlook on what the afterlife has in store for us. If you're a Buddhist or a Hindu, then that wouldn't be part of your hope for the future at all. You would expect to be reincarnated, and hopefully that you'd be reincarnated with people that you know. I can understand people not being happy about the thought that they don't recognize people. But I mean, as with Joan Rivers, where I mentioned she was reincarnated and believed that her daughter in a past life was her mother in this life, it was only under regression that became a conscious thought in her mind. But my belief is that probably at a deep subconscious level, she knew that, and we would all know that, and we would all recognize our soulmates or our family members, even though they are in a different body, in a different relationship. but it doesn't come to the surface, and it isn't a conscious recognition. And that, I suspect, is because it would complicate matters if we knew that. I mean, if a child that you have in this life, you suddenly realize was your father in the past life, then maybe you wouldn't scold the child or treat them like a child. You'd start treating them like a father figure, and I mean that might make your family development go astray. So the other thing, the other point I make often is that we must remember, if we live for eternity in some form, then the loved ones whose company we share in this life may well meet up with us at various stages in our in our soul journey. It might not be our next life; it might be the one after. But I'm sure that we are all, where we have special relationships, those will continue in some form, and we will know that, even though it may not be registered on our conscious minds.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, we've all had experiences where we're just very comfortable with someone more quickly than you would expect.
Yep.
And maybe we don't need more than that. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Green Meadow. And our next question is from Alan C. Moore.
Hi again, Roy. And I think that you've already touched on this a little bit, but perhaps you could say a little bit more. Do you think that reincarnation is an unavoidable process that all of us are going to have to go through forever? Or at some point, will there be other options, other opportunities that will present themselves?
You're right, Alan. I touched on it earlier, and I'm in a sort of a difficulty here, in as far as I personally believe that if reincarnation occurs for a few people, and that's all I'm claiming in the book, and I'm stating the cases where I think the evidence is very strong. But if it can happen for them, I think it must be something that is open to all of us. And I suspect that very few of us are evolved enough, or we learn enough in a single lifetime not to need to come back and have another life. Another point I'd like to make, actually, is that some people that I've spoken to are very skeptical of the whole idea of reincarnation. But when I talk to them about whether they believe in life after death, they say, "Oh, yes, we'll go into another dimension, or we'll go to heaven, or whatever." And I make the point to them, but hang on a minute, you realize, if you believe you are a spiritual being that has that ability to survive death, then you realize that you are actually at this time a spirit that's living in a body. So you've incarnated once. Why are you so against being incarnated a second time, or reincarnated? But for most people, they don't. Not most people. A lot of people don't like the concept of being coming back, and they prefer to think that they can go on. My own experience, and I'm sure you're probably the same, is that some of the best lessons I've learned in life have been tough ones. They've been hard knocks.
Absolutely. Yes.
Things you would have preferred not to have happened, but they happen, and you cope with them, and then you look back later on in life and realize that, however traumatic they were, that you are stronger for them, and
Yes.
you've learned lessons, and you go on. Now, my view is that if you go to heaven and everything is beautiful and the sun is always shining and there's always flowers and everything else, you're not going to have those knocks, unless the heaven has got a place you can go and be knocked about a bit to learn some lessons. So, maybe we just have to accept that this physical world in which we live, or maybe some other physical world in which we live, is the learning phase in our spiritual evolution, and maybe we're on a very low rung of the ladder, and until we get past that learning experience and realize that we are spiritual in nature, and there's more that matters to life than material possessions and everything else, then we'll probably have to keep coming back and until we learn that lesson. So that's pretty much where I stand. But I think as far as evidence is concerned, I can only really say, let's look at these cases. But there are lots of cases, I have to say. And I haven't touched on it yet, but I really would like to just make one point about some of the evidence in the book, which is that there is a physical dimension to some of the best evidence that really, I think, makes it very difficult for skeptics to dismiss the best reincarnation cases. And I'm talking about those cases where there are birthmarks and birth defects that a child has when born, which coincide with wounds or other physical defects that they suffered in their past life. I mean, there's a classic case of that, which Dr. Stevenson investigated in Turkey, of a man who could remember being a bandit, really, in his past life. So he wasn't someone famous, and he wasn't a celebrity. He was actually a baddie. He and his brother had murdered 2 men. They did so because their sisters had been raped, and that was their way of getting equal with the people they regarded as being the culprits. But as a result of that, they were on the run for quite a long time, until eventually the police surrounded a building in which they were and challenged them to come out. They didn't want to give themselves up to the police. The police set fire to the building to cause them to flush them out, really. And rather than come out, one of them, whose name was Camille, shot his brother, and then he put the muzzle of his gun under his chin, and he pulled the trigger of the gun using his toe, and he shot himself through the head, killed himself that way.
My goodness.
Now, not many years later, a little boy was born whose name his parents gave him the name of Dharam, but immediately he could talk, he refused to respond to that name and said his name was Camille. He described his past life and how he died, and he was so insistent that they call him Camille that eventually they changed his name by deed poll or whatever they do in Turkey, and so he officially became Camille. And what is really interesting about this case is that when this little boy was born, under his chin there was a wound that was bleeding, and he had to be taken to hospital and it had to be stitched up. And when he could talk, a few years later, he talked about this life as Camille and having shot himself and how it all happened. He had a very good memory of what happened. Now, Stevenson had investigated a lot of cases of birthmarks, birth defects, and he had come across quite a few cases where bullet wounds to the head that were the cause of death in a past life often left 2 birthmarks, because a bullet would usually go in one area and come out of another. And he went back to Turkey on a visit, and he saw Camille, who was then a man in his 30s, by the way, and he said, you've mentioned the birthmark under your chin. Have you any other birthmarks? And instantly, Camille pointed to the top of his head, which was covered in hair, of course, and said, yes, I've also got a birthmark there. And that was exactly where the bullet wound, the exit wound was and as testified in the police report, and also by the dead Camille's sister, who was a witness to his body and identified it, and she confirmed he was shot under the chin, and there was also part of the scalp and bone on top of his head had been dislodged by the bullet coming out. So this is not an isolated case. It is one which Stevenson has found in over 800 cases, I believe, where there are coinciding birthmarks. So we're dealing in reincarnation cases, we're not only dealing with children's memories that are very accurate, but we're dealing with a physical remnants or carryover from one life to the next, which are corroboratory of the cause, either the cause of death or injuries that were sustained during that those final moments on Earth before they died.
That is most interesting, and I find your logic to be very hard to argue against, and I agree with just about everything that you've said. Thank you so much, sir.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Alan Seymour. Roy, is there anything we have forgotten to ask you, or is there anything you would like to say before we wrap up for the evening?
I think the only thing I'd like to say is that I think in the West we have to be a lot more open and sympathetic to cases where children talk about past lives. I think there's a tendency in the West to be dismissive because we're not taught to believe in reincarnation. And children, of course, do have imaginary friends, and they're quite inventive, and it's easy to think that they might be making things up to gain attention. But if they give enough detail, as in the case of James Leiniger, the little boy that has, I think he's appeared on Oprah and other programs, who could remember being a World War II airman. If his parents listened to what he had to say and investigated what he said, and I think we'd probably come across a lot more cases. The other thing is that I would really love to see some sort of agency set up so that people around the world could report cases early on so that they could be investigated, because one of the real problems we have is getting to these cases soon enough before the families have met and the cases become contaminated. In other words, a child says, I can remember being this child in this person in a past life. The family goes to investigate. They take the child, and then the families start talking about the memories, and then it all becomes very confused. And by the time a reincarnation researcher gets on the scene, everyone's forgotten who said what to whom and when. It's not quite as bad as that sometimes, but it would be really good if we had more cases where the researcher arrived on the scene before any meeting with a past life family. Everything was recorded on video, and then the same was done when the meeting took place.
Thank you very much. That's fascinating. And I also hope that if families and people listen to the children in the stories, that offers an opportunity for healing of those past life memories that might need to do so. Thank you, Roy. We have been speaking with Roy Stemen, the author of the Big Book of Reincarnation. Roy's website is www.paranormalreview.com. Thank you so much for sharing your time and investigations with us today. It has been a pleasure, and the information you've given us has been quite remarkable. We hope the listeners have found your open-minded research helpful whilst asking the big questions of life, as well as appreciating your skeptical approach to reincarnation. On behalf of Fox and all the members of Time Monk Radio Forum, Thank you very much, Roy. And in our tradition, may you and yours have many tasty pies to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. That was absolutely wonderful and fascinating.
Thank you. That was awesome.
Yes.
Good. I appreciate that. Thank you. I enjoyed it.